Hi, my name is Marian Brown. I'm the Special Assistant for Campus and Community Sustainability at Ithaca College, and I'd like to welcome you to this video lecture in our Sustainability Lecture Series. I want to talk to you today about the various commitments that Ithaca College has made to sustainability, give you a little bit of the history and some of the impact of some of those commitments. The first commitment that Ithaca College made was as part of our mission development for the institution, and our mission actually is much longer than this, but this is the key element that I focus in on in terms of sustainability, that we want to have all of our graduates, indeed all of the members of our campus community, understand their roles and responsibilities as part of being a global citizen and what that implies. This was passed in 2001, and interestingly, this mission statement in no place says anything about sustainability, but it very much speaks to our sustainability work. Similarly, our comprehensive environmental policy, which was also passed in 2001, talks about more of our environmental focus on the campus. It takes a hard look at some of the practices that we have, both in education and in our operations and outreach efforts. And it looks to balance the educational, social, and financial leadership, again, some of the hallmarks of sustainability. But this is another document that does not say anything about the word sustainability in it, but speaks to sustainability principles and practices. So the first commitment that we have made under our comprehensive environmental policy is a commitment to environmental education. We want to have all of our graduates understand their impact on the environment and how they can be more mindful of it and more supportive of preservation of it. It also takes a look at environmentally preferred procurement principles. Through our buying practices on the campus, we can have a profound impact. The college is a big consumer of goods and services, and the more we can be mindful of the sustainability impacts of those decisions, the better we can have a positive impact on our triple bottom line, if you will. Our comprehensive environmental policy also takes a look and gives some specifics about how we might be able to do this. Two of the amendments to this policy that actually were made in 2008, as it lists here, the first was to really codify the desire to have ENERGY STAR rated or other similarly energy efficient equipment brought into the campus. This was actually a result of our climate action plan, which is another commitment I'll speak to in a few minutes. But this was then driven back into our comprehensive environmental policy to help guide some of those specific areas. So we amended our comprehensive environmental policy to add an ENERGY STAR procurement guideline. Similarly, we also expanded our procurement guideline to say ENERGY STAR is an example of one third-party certification for sustainability attributes, but there are others. Things like Green Seal, Eco Logo, EPEAT, which is a more advanced certification for energy equipment and computers and peripherals. So we added in an amendment to say that we should look for those kinds of objective third-party certifiers and certifications on products, so it helps guide that more sustainable decision-making. We certainly want to take a look at efficient use of our natural resources on campus, energy and water especially. So again, this was codifying that we want to be very mindful of our use of those resources. We also want to minimize solid waste production. It's not enough to really look at the 3 R's for recycling in particular, although we want to do that, but we want to really look at source reduction too. It's one thing to have materials that come in that then have to become part of a waste stream, no matter whether you're composting or recycling it. If you can reduce it in the first place, that's your best option. We also want to minimize hazardous waste and toxic materials on campus. This again is part of creating a more environmentally friendly campus. And we have a number of things. We really don't generate that many toxins, but there are a few. We do have radioactive materials used in the sciences. We do have hazardous chemicals that are used around campus, usually in small quantities, and they're carefully monitored. So we want to make sure that that is called out. Campus design is an interesting area, and we're starting to take a more holistic look at how you design the campus, our buildings, our grounds, to be more pedestrian friendly, to be more densely clustered, if you will, in terms of buildings, so you don't use up as much of our campus green space. It's very valuable. So we try to strive for that kind of design of our buildings and our infrastructure. Here again, we added an amendment, an important amendment to the comprehensive environmental policy as a result of our climate action planning. We added an amendment to build all new construction or to renovate major campus building projects to the standards of the LEED Silver or better protocols, because we recognize that careful upfront design will reap benefits in terms of energy efficiency and cost savings. So our comprehensive environmental policy was our first attempt, but I mentioned it didn't include the term sustainability. In 2006, then President Williams, signed Ithaca College onto something called the Talwara Declaration, which is an international agreement to foster sustainable thinking and practice on college campuses. This was the first time that we really used the term and embraced the term and committed to the term sustainability in terms of Ithaca College. So this is what follows are what the Talwara Declaration calls for. It's basically recognizing that institutions of higher learning have a profound impact, both in terms of the impact we have on our graduates, but also on our communities and on the people who work on our campuses, to be more mindful and be more aware. So first of all, we want to increase awareness in our campus community in particular about environmentally sustainable development. And that is as broad as it sounds like. It's infrastructure development, it's understanding everyone's role as a global citizen on the campus, hearkening back to our mission statement. We want to create an institutional culture of sustainability. We want everyone on campus to understand they're part of an organization that embraces sustainability and that every member of this campus community has a role and a responsibility to play in that, to make more sustainable decisions. We also want to educate for environmentally responsible citizenship. Again, hearkening back to our mission statement, this is very much calling for our understanding and support for the environmental piece of sustainability. Fostering environmental literacy, making sure all of our graduates and all of our employees understand all that there is entailed in having a good awareness of the environmental impacts. Practice institutional ecology. This really speaks to our practices, our policies and procedures on campus that mirror and support our sustainability objectives. And involving all stakeholders, making sure that we are involving everyone who should be involved and making them aware. And engaging them in making more sustainable decision making. Collaborations for interdisciplinary approaches. This is actually kind of interesting. We committed to this in 2006, and then we're now seeing some of this play out in the institution's rollout of IC 2020, which is calling for a very interdisciplinary educational program. Increasing capacity of primary and secondary schools. One would argue that there are limited roles here, and yet we have a strong education department here. So if we can make our educators who go into classrooms in the primary and secondary schools aware of their impact in turn and enhance the education of sustainability at lower grades, that's only going to benefit us in the future in terms of what it is we are trying to do with our incoming students and students who are here in continuing grades. I've always said that the problem with trying to do sustainability work at higher ed is we get our students 18 years too late. They come in with entrenched habits and opinions from many years of traditional culture in the mainstream, and we have the job of trying to change that model and turning that around. So how much better it would be if they came to us having a good understanding of at least the basics, and then we can focus on taking them deeper and giving them more direct skills and information. Broadening service and outreach, both on a national level and internationally. Again, part of our campus outreach efforts are to spread the word. Whatever we've learned, we want to share with others, whether it's about education or whether it is about our operational practices. And then finally, it's maintaining the movement, basically committing to not only keeping on with our sustainability efforts on campus, but trying to engage others, our peer institutions, our communities around us, anyone we come in contact with. More recently than the Talwara Declaration was our Climate Action Plan effort. In 2007, again, then President Williams signed the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, which was a very, very specific commitment. One of the problems with the Talwara Declaration was, as worthy as those goals and statements were, there were very few specifics behind it. That basically you could set up your own plan, your own targets, and it really didn't speak to reporting back, having any accountability for what we did or didn't do. And in our case, some of those things were very easy for us to tick off and say, yeah, we did that, we do this, we're working on this. But we didn't have to report on it to anyone. It was hard to hold ourselves accountable. The President's climate commitment took a very different tack. It had very, very, very specific guidelines for what you had to do, and requirements for accountability, for reporting on progress, not only in the early years, but on a continuing basis. And so this helps to hold ourselves accountable internally as well, knowing that we have the responsibility and the value, if you will, of being able to provide those reports, because not only do we provide our reports, we have the ability to look at others' reports so we can learn and share from one another about best practices and what's working and how you overcome challenges. So President Williams, as I mentioned, signed the American College and University President's Climate Commitment in 2007. And for us, at that moment, the clock started to tick because we had a 2-year window to complete our plan, develop our plan, and start to roll it out. The first year was ideally going to be involved with inventorying our impact. And going into this planning process, we had the good fortune that we knew exactly what our greenhouse gas emissions inventory was, because we'd had a series of students in the biology department who'd conducted the campus-wide greenhouse gas emissions inventories for several years. So we knew what our impact was, and it was substantial, but it gave us a leg up on that planning time frame. So we already had that, and going into this in 2007, which was our baseline, we had just under 33,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases that we were emitting into the atmosphere. And we also knew going in that we'd already seen a pattern of declining emissions, generally because of some of the energy efficiency measures that we were putting into place. So we felt fairly comfortable signing that we were going to be able to make good progress. So within 2 years, I mentioned, we had to develop our target date for achieving neutrality. And then establish some interim targets as well. And then we had to outline what actions we would take over that period of time between our plan being approved and when we set our target date. So our climate action plan was due September 15th of 2009, and we met that goal. And we established our climate target and timeline of 100% by 2050, which basically means when our plan started in fiscal year 2010, that we have a 40-year plan, meaning we need to achieve at least a 2.5% per year reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing I mentioned before with Talwara, one of the deficiencies of the Talwara was that it didn't really require any accountability. It didn't ask you to commit to anything other than some general statements. So the developers of the climate commitment recognize that and ask that institutions, while they're in their planning process, initiate one or more of the following steps. And again, we were very fortunate because going into this, we were already doing some of them, and I'll mention what those are. The first one was we had the option of establishing a policy that all new construction would be built to at least LEED Silver standard or the equivalent. And I mentioned before that we did take that step, and as a matter of amendment to our comprehensive environmental policy, we signed on to that one. We also, in B, that's where you see the rising of that commitment to the Energy Star certification program. And again, we took it a step further because we added an additional amendment that asked for our institutional buyers to take a look, be very watchful, and specify that they wanted to see third-party certifiers of other products, not just electronic appliances, where the Energy Star rating applies. The policy of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions, we're still pending on that one. We have that under discussion, but that will be down the road. We didn't commit to it on the first round. D, going in, we already were supporting access to public transit, both for faculty and staff commuting, and also through our underwriting of student passes on about a 30% basis. So that one was one we could tick off going in. We were already doing that one. So going in, just on these first four, we already were doing one, and we agreed to do two more. So we were already ahead of the game. For E, within a year, we had the option of agreeing to begin to purchase or produce at least 15% green energy. We were already purchasing some for our LEED Platinum buildings, but we are not yet at anywhere near 15%, so that's not one we can tick off and say we've done. And again, these were interim steps that you should be doing some of these things while you're developing your long-range plan. But these are things in many cases that feed into the long-range success of climate action planning. F, which is developing a policy to look at shareholder proposals around sustainability. We are not going to consider that at this time. We don't manage our investment portfolio in a way that would allow us to take advantage of this. But G, again, going in, we had been participating in Recyclemania for as many years as we were allowed to do so, so that was one we could tick off. So we are already over the 2 or more before we started. And then again, in 3, we committed to making not only our plan publicly available, but our greenhouse gas emissions inventories, which continue to be done on an annual basis, which is our way of tracking how we're doing. So I'll just briefly want to walk you through our climate action planning process. There's more information that you can learn about this. In fact, there's another video lecture that goes into in depth about this if you're interested. But for now, I'll just give you the highlights. When we conducted our inventories, we looked at 3 areas of climate gas emissions, and those are Scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 really refers to the materials, fossil fuels basically, that we burn, combust on campus. For us, the major area of emissions impact is the combustion of natural gas that we use to heat our buildings on campus. A small amount of gasoline and diesel fuel is used for college fleet vehicles or for lawn maintenance equipment, et cetera. And a very, very small proportion is chemicals that are used on campus. Refrigerants in air conditioning, chillers, fertilizers that are used on the green space. Those are very minimal. Scope 2, which is about half of our impact, or it was in 2007, is the purchased electricity. This is called indirect greenhouse gas emissions because we purchase all of our electricity from power plants that in turn combust fossil fuels, whether it's natural gas or whether it's coal. At this time, we were purchasing a lot from a coal-fired power plant that since has been shuttered, but much electricity in this area is still coming from natural gas combustion. So it's called indirect because while we don't burn it directly on campus, our demand for it means it has to be indirectly combusted elsewhere. And Scope 3 is sort of a catch-all area, but the biggest area here is commuting, interestingly, both staff and faculty and student commuting. And some people would wonder why it is that the college has to absorb the impact of commuting emissions. Wouldn't that be the individual's responsibility? And the answer to that is yes, it is the individual's responsibility, except that they wouldn't be incurring those emissions, or you can make the case they wouldn't be incurring those emissions unless they were coming to school either for work or for class. So we do have to have that on our balance sheet, if you will. We do have to account for those emissions. So another area is business travel, and this is not just where employees from the campus go out to conferences or professional meetings. It's also athletic travel, it's also international student travel. Again, these things wouldn't be happening unless folks were here at Ithaca College, so that has to be accounted for. Solid waste generation for us is also part of Scope 3. So Scopes 1 and 2 account for 3/4 of our impact and generally are related to buildings. And Scope 3, again, is that catch-all, which is mostly related to transportation. So, and here is some of the breakdown of how those work. Again, electricity is electricity. Natural gas is the bulk of Scope 1 in blue, with fleet being a very small 2% and the chemicals being less than 1% actually. And in the green area, you can see the impact of commuting from employees, 15%, commuting by students, about 2%, and then business travel, around 7% of that, 24% of the whole pie. And so solid waste, again, is a small piece of that. When we developed our climate action plan, we looked at a number of different strategies for reducing emissions. Again, most of them related to building energy use because that's the greatest part of our impact, as we recognize. And we put all of our evaluations through what's called a triple bottom line plus evaluation, taking a look at the environmental, the social, and the economic considerations. But we also added a fourth area, the plus area. It's kind of taking a look at what it means on an institutional basis for each decision that we do. So for a lighting upgrade, for instance, we looked at the impact in those 4 areas. We used a green, yellow, red scale. So green is all systems are go. We definitely should do that. There's no cautions. Yellow is something to be, there's additional considerations to be aware of. We also had, in some cases, we had some red. Some, we just don't feel we can proceed at this time. Generally, those were economic. Some things had a really positive environmental, even social impact, but might have a truly negative, a very, very costly impact. So you might actually, on some of our, in our climate action plan, which is viewable online, you will see some of those considerations spelled out. But on the institutional, we took a look at, for, let's say, the lighting upgrade as being an example. What does upgrading lighting say about the campus? Is it a good thing? You can argue that it's looking at, it's demonstrating that Ithaca College is an effective steward of financial resources being given to us by our students in the forms of tuition, which really supports 90% of our operating on campus. You might question why in the social arena there is sort of a cautionary flag being thrown, the yellow block there. And the answer in this case is that we needed to be very careful about how we reduce emissions by cutting lighting. We don't want to take lighting out if it's going to impact human health and safety. So here are some of the other ways that we evaluated this. I'm not going to go into detail. If you want to know more about this, you can either read our climate action plan, which is available online, and it goes into great detail about each and every one of these. But suffice to say, in our evaluation, if it's red, it had a capital cost to be able to make this happen. But then the third column over speaks to what would be the net savings over the 40-year time frame. And these are not in dollars and cents, although it looks like that. These are in millions of dollars. The key is that these are in dollars. So you have to add a few zeros to this. But so you can see the impact in some cases is quite substantial. We would be looking at, for efficiency standards, basically the Energy Star standards, there are no capital costs because that basically is a well-accepted standard. And yet the savings can be on the order of, over that 40 years, $1.3 million. So that was an easy one to say, yeah, we definitely should do that. That's a good win. But unfortunately, in the last column, what you see is the contribution towards neutrality is quite low. These are in metric tons of CO2 over that 40 years, and this would only, the efficiency standards on appliances alone were projected to be not that high. But some of the others would have a substantial impact, or could have. So boiler upgrades, for instance, while you have a capital cost, you get savings and you get a pretty good impact. So those are things we're prioritizing more highly. On the area of travel, though, you will see that in many cases you would have a significant investment in transportation infrastructure. But if people aren't taking it, which is a problem, and are still continuing to drive their single occupant vehicle to campus, you're not going to get much benefit. So here again, we took a look at when we would phase in some of these. I would commend you to take a look at the Climate Action Plan in electronic form so you can see more deeply about this if you're interested. But just briefly, here's some of the ways that we're going to go after it, the emissions reductions through our plan. And a lot of it relates to behavior. You'll see behavior in years 1 to 5, trying to get the members of our campus community to understand their roles and responsibilities as part of our campus community to be effective stewards and be conservators of natural resources. We have much work to do there. We can make our buildings as smart and intuitive as possible and independently controlled as possible in some respects, but we also need to have the occupants of our buildings be as smart and intuitive about their resource use. So the first 5 years, this is basically spelled out in more depth in the plan. And it speaks to metering, getting a handle on what we're actually using. We still don't have complete data in some cases, and we want to know more. But we want to start integrating controls for lighting and heating and ventilation systems, and basically fill in the gaps of our information while we're continuing to do some updates. Retrocommissioning, which is down on the list here, speaks to going through all of our existing buildings infrastructure, the boilers, the chillers, the drives and such that move air and heat around a building, and make sure that they're in peak operating condition. Things over time tend to get tweaked a little bit and they get out of peak performance conditions, and so want to put them all back in the best condition so we're maximizing the energy. We also want to look at some more of the policy areas on campus, how we're using space, taking a look at whether we could do a different delivery system for especially our building heating through a central utility plant. So we're looking a lot at kind of setting the stage, if you will, for going deeper in this first 5 years. But our climate action plan focuses heavily on 3 area strategies: controlling demand, basically doing what we can to be more efficient, improving system efficiency, and then looking down the road at switching fuels to less intensive fuel sources, away from fossil fuels though. Transportation, the same set of strategies and different outcomes. So in terms of, again, commitments that Ithaca College has made, I would put it off onto you as viewers and to think about your role and responsibility as a member of the campus community. Again, I talked about making buildings as smart and intuitive and independent of their occupants as possible. There's a tremendous amount that all the members of our campus community can do as well, and we need to have you do as well. And you can see what these impacts have. So for instance, if we don't burn a therm of natural gas, that's 13.5 pounds of CO2 that we don't release. And how do we not combust a therm of natural gas? Well, in the residence hall areas where we have issues with temperature control, where people on the ground floor may be sweltering or may be cold, but people on the top floor are sweltering, so the people on the top floor open the window, which basically just means more natural gas is combusted to keep driving things through the building. It's a very, very inefficient and wasteful way of managing the building temperature. There are better ways. So we need to improve those building systems, but we could have the occupants basically think about not opening their windows and open their doors instead to the hallway. It's been demonstrated that that simple strategy alone can help regulate the building better. But taking a shorter shower, using 1 less gallon of hot water can save a significant amount of CO2. And that's when a shower uses about 7 to 10 gallons per minute. If you're taking a 20-minute shower, can you think about taking a 10-minute shower or a 5-minute shower and think of the impact that simple step would have with each shower that you take. You notice an important distinction here. Composting and recycling, I mean, while some of these have pounds of CO2 that they minimize, composting and recycling have a profound impact. And I mentioned on our Scope 3 that solid waste generation was only about 2%, I think, of that Scope 3 impact. But But the more we can have, again, doing waste minimization, as we talked about in our comprehensive environmental policy, but if we have waste, can we make sure it's effectively managed on the back end and it's gotten into either recycling or composting streams? You see with recycling, 1 ton of paper that doesn't make it into the landfill reduces 1 ton of CO2. So you see why Ithaca College is being very, very supportive of recycling efforts out and about. But you see what the impact of composting is. If we can keep 1 ton of food waste out of the landfill and into a compost process instead, that saves 2 tons of CO2. So you might now understand why it is we're really supporting composting separation in areas on campus as well, because those are areas that can have really profound impacts, and we really need everybody's help on campus to support those programs. So the first 5 years, how are we doing? We've completed metering, we're doing upgrades and controls. Some of these are, the one that we can say we've done right away is hired an energy manager. We identified that position as something we needed to have early in our process to really guide a lot of the energy reductions. But we have some other areas where we haven't started yet. We're about midway through that first 5 years and we need to step up the pace, I would say, but we are being diligent about this and we're getting to things as we can. We are studying some of these other areas. So even if we get to, even if we, with our first 5-year plan, you can see we're going to get to a point where we're doing everything that we can. We're only going to get so far. The big purple bar is basically we're not going to have to do anything. The utilities from whom we purchase our electricity are themselves being forced through legislation to kind of clean up their own act. So we're going to get the benefit of that, but that, you see, doesn't get us all the way there. It only gets us about half the way there, or maybe 40% of the way there over 40 years, because that's a slow phase in for them. And so we are going to do some other things, and then the bottom black are, we don't know. These are, we might have to consider alternate strategies for how we're going to get the rest of the way. So years 6 to 15, these are some other ways we're going to be getting into it. And again, there's more details in the Climate Action Plan. But here's where you're going to start to see some phasing in. That's fuel switching I talked about. It's going to be more renewables that you'll see on campus, we hope, more alternative fuel vehicles. But really, if you look at our plan, there isn't a lot of specificity here as there is in the first 5 years, because we recognize that we can't look out that far and really know what are going to be the new hot technologies that will really help us take advantage of massive greenhouse gas emissions reductions and energy savings. One of the strategies we are looking at is a central utility plant. Right now we have individual building plants, basically a boiler and a chiller in each building or in small groups of buildings. And if we created what Cornell has always had, and that is a central utility plant where they combust fuels in one place and then feed out the, in their case, steam to various buildings on campus, and they also have lake source cooling for air conditioning. That central utility plant, you have the ability to switch fuels much more readily to less intensive source fuels and reduce your emissions that way. And so for us to create that is a massive proposition that we have done some costing and the cost benefit on. You see, that could actually get us even farther down here than we might have gotten on our own. So it's a reasonable strategy, but not without a lot of considerations to be made, and we're actually doing an independent study about that right now. So years 16 out, again, there's some things we're thinking about, but we don't know whether they're going to play out like geo-exchange on a large scale. But you'll see in those gray areas, that's why we don't know. We simply don't know in those outlying years how we're going to get the rest of the way. Again, more PV systems, more best practices in energy efficiency, more alternative fuel vehicles, all kinds of things. But absent some kind of a silver bullet, we're not sure how we'll get the rest of the way out. There is a strategy that's called purchasing offsets, which basically says we're going to invest in somebody else's energy production, renewable energy production of electricity or heating, and but we'll take the credit for it and reduce our balance sheet that way. So even though we can't do it on campus, we'll be improving the infrastructure elsewhere. But again, we just don't know. But we were comfortable with that with our climate action planning process, because we recognize that this is an ongoing process and we'll continue to revisit it. And as I say, if you want to see how we do, check back in 2050. But it's an ongoing process, and our plan is continually updated, and as new technology comes on board, we adopt that and include it into the plan. The most recent sustainability commitment that we made is to the ASHE STARS system. And this was developed by the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. And this is a program that was developed by sustainability professionals on college campuses, specifically to measure and track the important elements we felt of sustainability on campus. And it's much broader than the Climate Action Plan, which in large measure looks at just energy and transportation impacts. This is going to look at a whole host of other elements, including food, looks more deeply at waste reduction strategies. Here are a number, again, the STARS protocol is available online. This is difficult to see this, but this is basically looking at the areas of that are looked at in the STARS program that are not looked at in any of the other previous commitments that we've made. Taking a look at education, and in this case it also looks not just at classroom education but co-curricular, and looks more deeply at research opportunities. In the areas of operation, it's looking at things like I mentioned, dining services, grounds. It looks more deeply at the procurement practices. It does look at waste, and it looks at water, which for us is an important emerging area to really consider strongly. And it also looks at planning and some of the governance issues within an institution. How diverse and affordable is the institution, for instance? What kinds of training do we do for our staff and faculty? What are our investment practices? And how do we reach out into the community? So it looks at a really, really broad range of things. And Ithaca College went into the STARS program knowing that this might in fact help us tease out some of the areas where we needed to do additional work. The Climate Action Plan looks at a very specific set of goals and objectives, and some of those are included in here. Climate is one of the objectives of STARS, to make sure that we're measuring those things. But there are other measures too of true campus sustainability. Here, for instance, is taking a look at building energy consumption and some of the criteria of have we reduced our building energy consumption per gross square foot of building space compared to a 2005 baseline. I mean, very, very specific measures, and it allows for that kind of comparison across institutions. So, and again, we are required to make our reports on our progress public here, because it's not for us how we do, it's how are we improving over time, and it's what can we learn from one another. What is another institution who maybe has met this kind of a goal or has made more progress than we have? What opportunities do they have? What can we learn from them? What can we share with other institutions about what we have done and how and why? So it's very useful in that way. So energy, for instance, again, more of the drill down in the energy stream, but there are points that you can get for different activities. You have LED lighting. Interestingly, LED lighting in our Climate Action Plan was not originally called out because we were considering LED as being too costly to be able to implement on a short-term basis. Fairly shortly into implementation of our plan, LED lighting became much more available, much more cost competitive, and so we've been doing a lot of integration of that. And so there's some interesting things there that are called out. So I'm pleased to say that when we did our first inventory, comprehensive inventory using the STARS system, we achieved a gold rating. And only about, 40 out of 200 actually received that kind of a score. But there is a higher level, and I think we all aspire, again, to doing better over time and being able to get to that higher level of campus sustainability. So I would ask you, in closing, I would just ask you to think about, as a member of the campus community, what kinds of commitments can you make to improving campus sustainability? Thank you.